Unlock this vault and take $300 million. The oil baron mocked the black driver's daughter, and then she did it in 45 seconds. Sometimes the children we overlook carry gifts that can topple empires. Sometimes one moment of courage can expose decades of hidden crimes. And sometimes justice arrives in the small hands of an 8-year-old girl who saw patterns no one else could see. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've got something extraordinary lined up for you. Now, let's continue. The office smelled of expensive cigars and desperation. Harold Dan's Texas oil compound had witnessed many things over the years: billion-dollar deals sealed with handshakes, environmental reports quietly filed away, communities sacrificed for profit margins. But nothing like this. 7 days of failure. 7 days of watching his carefully constructed empire threaten to collapse because he couldn't access a vault he designed to be impenetrable. It was 3:15 p.m. when everything changed. Dan stood in the center of his private office, surrounded by the best vault specialists money could hire. The titanium monolith, 8 feet of German engineering towering against the wall, mocked him with its glowing red, locked status. This was supposed to be his protection, his fortress against regulators and rivals he didn't trust. Now it was his prison. In desperation, fueled by bourbon and panic, Dan made an offer that would destroy him. $300 million to anyone who can crack this vault. The technician stopped working, stunned. Business partners exchanged glances. Lawyers looked alarmed. That was a binding contract, made in front of witnesses. But in the corner, barely noticed by anyone, stood 8-year-old Nikki James, small for her age, wearing her bright yellow dress and pink hair ribbons, clutching her father's hand. The daughter of Fred, the driver who'd chauffeured Dan for 12 years. The little girl Dan had dismissed with casual racism since she first appeared in the back seat of his limousine. Nikki knew the sequence. She'd seen Dan open it 10 days ago, had watched with her remarkable pattern recognition abilities as the celebrating oil baron performed the biometric sequence, laughing at his own genius. But Nikki had learned to be invisible. Dan had taught her that. Every slur directed at her father, every dismissive glance, every cruel comment about the help and their kind. Until this moment. "Mr. Dan, may I try?" Nikki said softly, stepping forward. The room froze. Every head turned toward the small black girl in the yellow dress. Dan's face went from shock to recognition to something darker. That look, the one Nikki knew too well from the back seat, the look that said she didn't belong, that she had no right to even speak in this space, much less touch his million-dollar vault. But before we see what happens next, you need to understand how we got here. You need to know who Harold Dan really is, who Nikki and her father Fred are, and what led to this moment of reckoning. Because this isn't just a story about a locked vault. This is a story about years of silent suffering, about environmental racism disguised as business decisions, about a child learning to be invisible in her own skin while watching everything from the back seat. This is about communities poisoned for profit, about cancer clusters hidden in file boxes, about an oil baron who believed his wealth made him untouchable. Let me take you back to when this vault was first installed. Back to when Fred first became Dan's driver 12 years ago. Back to when a little girl with an extraordinary gift first climbed into that back seat and started seeing patterns, patterns in light sequences, patterns in hand movements, and patterns in how powerful men hurt people who look like her. This is how it all began. Harold Dan had always been obsessed with control. At 40 years old, lean and tan with cold blue eyes and an ever-present Rolex, he'd built his oil empire on the principle that trust was a liability only weak men could afford. His Texas compound sprawled across 25 acres of perfectly maintained grounds, protected by 12-foot security fences, motion sensors, and surveillance cameras that captured every angle. The main house alone was worth $32 million. Every piece of art on the walls was authenticated. Every vehicle in the garage cost 6 figures. Even his private helipad was positioned for maximum security. But it wasn't enough. "I don't trust anyone," Dan told the 3 German vault engineers sitting across from him in his private office. "Not my board of directors, not my business partners, not the government regulators breathing down my neck. And certainly not the people who work for me." The engineers from Vault Tech Berlin exchanged glances. They'd flown in from Munich specifically for this consultation, bringing schematics of their most sophisticated models. Each vault they presented was state-of-the-art: biometric access, quantum encryption, seismic sensors, pressure-activated failsafes. Dan rejected them all. "Too standard," he said, waving dismissively at the glossy brochures. "If you've built 10 of them, someone can crack one of them. I want something unique. One of a kind. No blueprints filed with regulators, no duplicates, no bypass codes, no manufacturer override. Nothing." Dr. Klaus Werner, the lead engineer, a precise man with silver-rimmed glasses and 3 decades of experience, leaned forward. "Mr. Dan, what you're describing is extraordinarily expensive. And if you forget the access sequence—" "I won't forget," Dan interrupted, his voice hard. "I remember every deal I've made, every competitor I've buried, every inspection I've passed. What I need is a vault that's completely impenetrable. Something designed so that EPA investigators, business rivals, even federal agents with a warrant can't access what's inside without my cooperation. Can you do that or not?" Dr. Werner paused, studying the oil baron across the desk. He'd worked with paranoid billionaires before, but something about Dan's intensity was different. This wasn't just about protecting wealth. This was about hiding something. "We can," Werner said slowly. "But understand, there will be no backup access. No emergency override. No manufacturer key. If something goes wrong, if you lose the sequence, we cannot help you. The vault will remain sealed indefinitely." Dan smiled, cold and confident. "Perfect." $850,000, and 3 months later, the vault arrived. It came in an armored convoy, delivered by a team of 12 technicians who spent 2 days installing it. The titanium alloy structure stood 8 feet tall and weighed 4 tons. The biometric access panel featured cutting-edge pressure-sensitive technology, 12 zones that required precise finger placement, exact pressure levels, and a specific sequence that existed nowhere except in the owner's memory. No electronics that could be hacked. No mechanical locks that could be picked. Just pure engineering and human memory standing between the world and whatever secrets lay inside. The day the installation was completed, Dan stood in his office, watching the technicians bolt the massive structure to the reinforced concrete floor. Through the window, he could see his compound's daily operations continuing, security personnel patrolling the perimeter, maintenance staff tending the grounds, and in the garage, Fred James, his driver of 12 years, methodically washing the fleet of luxury vehicles. Fred had worked for Dan since the early days, when the company was smaller, the money newer, the crimes less sophisticated. Dan barely noticed him most days, which was exactly how he preferred it. Drivers were meant to be invisible, to anticipate routes without being seen or heard, to witness conversations without remembering them. What Dan never realized was that Fred remembered everything. And so did his daughter. When the installation crew finally packed up their equipment and left, Dan locked his office door. He approached the vault with the reverence others might reserve for a religious icon. This was his fortress, his protection against a world that wanted to take what was his, or expose what he'd taken from others. He spent an hour programming and testing the biometric sequence, his fingers moving across the glowing panel in a pattern he'd memorized: tap tap slide, press hold release, double tap in specific zones, final sustained pressure. Each correct touch produced a blue light. Each mistake would trigger a red warning and a 12-hour lockout. When the sequence was complete, the vault door opened with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, Dan began placing his most valuable, and most damaging, possessions. Bearer bonds worth $120 million. Cryptocurrency hardware wallets containing another $80 million. Offshore account access codes for holdings in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore, $200 million more in liquid assets. But more important than the money were the documents. File boxes labeled in his own handwriting: EPA Violation Reports 2006 to 2024, confidential. Trinity County Cancer Cluster Study, do not release. Bribery receipts, EPA inspectors. Contaminated site coordinates. Maps showing 23 communities surrounding his refineries, communities Dan had deliberately chosen because they were predominantly Black and Latino, too poor to fight back legally, too politically powerless to matter. Internal health studies his own medical consultants had prepared, showing cancer rates 3 times the national average in neighborhoods downwind from his facilities. Studies he'd suppressed while publicly testifying to state legislators that his refineries posed no health risks. Spreadsheets calculating acceptable mortality rates by demographic. Memos discussing how to manage community complaints. Correspondence with EPA officials who'd taken bribes to overlook violations. 18 years of evidence. 18 years of environmental crimes committed with calculated precision against communities he'd targeted for their vulnerability. All of it went into the vault. As Dan closed the door and watched the status display change from green open to red locked, he felt a surge of satisfaction. This was it, the perfect defense. No one could touch him now. Not the EPA investigators who'd been sniffing around. Not the community activists filing complaints. Not the business rivals who'd love to see him fall. And certainly not the service staff who moved through his compound like shadows. Dan poured himself a bourbon, savoring the burn. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched the sunset paint his 25 acres in gold and amber. A compound worth $70 million. An oil empire generating $300 million annually. A vault that was truly impenetrable. He was untouchable. Or so he thought. What Dan didn't know, couldn't have predicted, was that 10 days later, his perfect fortress would become his perfect prison. That his paranoia would trap him as effectively as it was meant to trap others. And that the person who would ultimately unlock his vault, exposing all his crimes to the world, would be someone he'd never considered worth noticing. Someone he dismissed and degraded from the moment she first appeared in the back seat of his limousine, quiet and observant, with a mind that saw patterns others couldn't see. But that revelation was still 10 days away. For now, Dan stood in his office, bourbon in hand, admiring his fortress of titanium and his empire of oil, completely unaware that empires built on poisoned ground have a way of contaminating everything they touch, including the man who built them. The vault was locked. The evidence was secure. The community's continued suffering in silence. Fred James finished washing the vehicles and headed back to the servant quarters where his 8-year-old daughter waited, working on another puzzle, seeing patterns, always seeing patterns. And the countdown had begun. The servant quarters sat behind the main compound, a modest 2-bedroom structure that Dan provided as part of Fred's compensation package. It wasn't much, but it was clean, safe, and rent-free. For a single father raising a daughter on a driver's salary, that mattered more than pride. Fred found Nikki exactly where he'd left her that morning, cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by puzzle pieces. A 1,000-piece image of the solar system was taking shape before her, planets and stars emerging from chaos with remarkable speed. "How was your day, baby girl?" Fred asked, setting down his keys. "Good, Daddy." Nikki didn't look up, her small fingers selecting pieces with uncanny precision. "I finished my math homework. Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm working 2 grades ahead." Fred smiled, pride swelling in his chest. His daughter was special, the school counselor had confirmed it when Nikki was 5. Pattern recognition abilities far beyond normal. A mind that processed visual information differently, seeing connections others missed. "Mr. Dan got a new safe today," Fred said, moving to the kitchen to start dinner. "Big fancy thing from Germany. Must have cost him a fortune." "What's it for?" Nikki asked, finally looking up. "Rich people stuff, I guess. Money, important papers." Fred paused, remembering what he'd glimpsed through the office window during installation, those file boxes with labels that made his stomach twist. Documents he doesn't want anyone to see. "Everything has a pattern, Daddy," Nikki said matter-of-factly, returning to her puzzle. "Even secrets." Fred didn't respond, but her words lingered. Through the window earlier, he'd watched Dan supervising the vault installation with an intensity that seemed excessive even for him. The oil baron's hands had been shaking slightly as he programmed the access sequence. Not from fear, but from excitement. Whatever was going inside that vault, Dan was desperate to protect it. Or hide it. Fred had driven Dan for 12 years. He'd heard things, phone conversations about EPA inspections, discussions of managing community complaints, references to neighborhoods near refineries that Dan spoke about with casual contempt. He'd seen the pattern, even if he didn't have all the pieces. But Fred had learned long ago that seeing things and speaking about them were 2 different choices. One kept you employed. The other got you fired, blacklisted, disappeared from the industry entirely. So he stayed silent. Drove the routes. Washed the cars. Collected his paycheck. Raised his daughter in the shadow of an empire built on secrets. "Daddy, can you help me with this corner?" Nikki held up 2 puzzle pieces. "They should fit, but the colors are tricky." Fred knelt beside his daughter, studying the pieces. They were nearly identical, subtle differences in shading that most people would miss entirely. But Nikki had already identified which one belonged where. "You've already figured it out, haven't you?" he said softly. Nikki grinned. "Patterns are easy, Daddy. Everything has a pattern. You just have to pay attention." 10 days later, those words would change everything. Fred James woke at 4:30 a.m., the same time he had every weekday for 12 years. At 35, his body had learned the rhythm: rise before dawn, prepare the vehicles, be ready when Dan needed him. Always ready, always invisible, always silent. He'd come to this job from the Army, where he'd been a mechanic specializing in transport vehicles. After his discharge, he'd worked 2 jobs trying to support himself and his newborn daughter after his wife died in childbirth. When Dan Oil Corporation posted an opening for a personal driver at $38,000 a year, below market rate, but with housing included, Fred had applied immediately. 12 years later, he was still here. Still driving. Still invisible. His daily routine was clockwork: vehicle maintenance at dawn, driving Dan to morning meetings across Houston's business district, waiting in parking garages during lunch appointments, ferrying the oil baron to evening dinners with investors, then late-night returns to the compound. Sometimes 1 a.m., sometimes 3, depending on how much Dan had been drinking. From the driver's seat, Fred heard everything. Conversations about handling EPA inspections. Discussions of acceptable contamination levels in communities near refineries. Phone calls where Dan referred to Fred's people with casual contempt, made jokes about the help, assumed Fred was too stupid to understand what was being discussed. But Fred understood. He just couldn't afford to acknowledge it. He needed the job. Needed the health insurance that covered Nikki's doctor visits. Needed the stable housing that kept his daughter safe and fed. So he taught her what he'd learned: we're here to work, baby. Keep quiet, stay out of the way, don't draw attention. Nikki had learned the lesson well. Too well, perhaps. At 8 years old, she was extraordinary, diagnosed at 5 with savant-level pattern recognition abilities by the school psychologist. She could solve 1,000-piece puzzles in under an hour. Memorize musical sequences after one hearing. See mathematical patterns in everyday objects that adults with advanced degrees would miss. Nikki processes visual information differently, Mrs. Rodriguez, her teacher, had explained during their last conference. She sees connections others miss. This is a genuine gift. But their underfunded public school had no gifted programs, no resources for children like her. So Nikki spent her days in the servant quarters doing advanced puzzles, reading library books checked out in stacks, watching patterns emerge in everything around her. During school breaks, she accompanied Fred to work, sitting quietly in the back seat of Dan's limousine. An invisible child of an invisible father. Dan barely acknowledged her existence beyond occasional cruel comments. Keep your kid out of my office, Fred. This isn't daycare. Mostly, though, Nikki was simply unseen. Another piece of background furniture in Dan's world. But while she sat invisible in that back seat, Nikki observed everything. Business meetings conducted in the car. Dan's behaviors and routines. The patterns of his life. This invisibility, Fred would later realize, had become her greatest advantage. 10 days ago, Harold Dan closed the deal of his life. The Saudi contract, $2 billion over 5 years, represented the largest acquisition in Dan Oil Corporation's history. New drilling rights, exclusive refinery access, profit margins that would dwarf everything he'd built before. Dan had flown to Riyadh personally, sealed the agreement with handshakes and signatures, and returned to Houston drunk on champagne and victory. At 11:47 p.m., Fred pulled the limousine through the compound gates. It had been a long night, an emergency pickup from the airport, Dan celebrating loudly in the back seat, multiple stops at bars where the oil baron had continued drinking. In the rear seat behind her father, Nikki had fallen asleep hours ago, her head resting against the window. Go park the car, Fred, Dan slurred as they stopped at the main house. I've got business to handle. Fred nodded, watching in the rearview mirror as Dan stumbled toward his office entrance. The oil baron was talking to himself, loud enough to be heard through the closing door. Need to update offshore accounts, move the Saudi money, secure everything. Fred drove toward the garage, glancing back at his sleeping daughter. She'd been so patient tonight, never complaining during the long wait. He'd make her favorite breakfast in the morning, let her sleep in as late as she wanted. He didn't notice when Nikki's eyes opened. Didn't see her slip quietly from the car as he backed it into the garage bay. Nikki moved through the shadows like she'd been taught, invisible, silent, unnoticed. The main house door Dan had entered was slightly ajar, a wedge of light spilling onto the pathway. Through it, she could hear his voice, still talking to himself with the loose enthusiasm of the very drunk. My beautiful fortress. Let me secure my victory. Curiosity drew her forward. The same curiosity that made her solve puzzles, seek patterns, understand systems others found incomprehensible. She peered through the partially open door. Dan stood before the massive titanium vault, swaying slightly but focused. His fingers hovered over the glowing biometric panel, and even from her position in the doorway, Nikki could see the 12 zones illuminated in soft white light, waiting for input. Upper left, Dan narrated to himself, his finger touching the panel. A blue light flashed where he pressed. Upper left again. Another blue flash. Now slide right? His finger dragged across the surface to zone 3. Blue light followed the movement. Nikki's mind engaged automatically, the way it always did when confronted with patterns. Her savant brain began recording, not just watching, but storing every detail with perfect clarity. Middle pressure point, press and hold. Dan's finger found zone 6, held for 3 seconds. Blue light sustained, then released. Double tap bottom corners. His fingers moved in rapid sequence, tap zone 3, tap zone 7, tap zone 11, tap zone 2. For blue flashes in rhythm. Final hold. Zone 9, sustain pressure for 5 seconds. The entire panel blazed blue. A hydraulic hiss filled the office. The massive vault door swung open smoothly, revealing its contents. Dan stepped closer, peering inside with satisfaction. Even from the doorway, Nikki could see stacks of cash, leather folders, and file boxes with handwritten labels. One box faced outward, its label clearly visible, confidential, EPA violation records 2006 to 2024. All safe. All mine, Dan laughed, his words echoing in the quiet office. No regulator will ever see these reports. No community activist will ever prove what we did. He stood there for a long moment, admiring his hidden empire. Then he closed the vault, performing the locking sequence, a reverse pattern that Nikki's mind captured with the same precision. The pattern was complete. Stored. Permanent. Tap tap slide. Press hold release. Double tap zones 3-7-11-2. Final press hold zone 9. Nikki had seen it all. Every hand movement. Every pressure point. Every light sequence. Her brain had transformed it into a puzzle, not cardboard pieces fitting together, but touches and lights creating a pattern as clear to her as musical notes on a page. She retreated silently, slipping back through the shadows just as Dan collapsed onto his office couch, unconscious before his head hit the leather. "Baby, what are you doing out of the car?" Fred's voice startled her in the hallway. He'd finished parking and come looking for her, concern etched on his face. "Just watching patterns, Daddy," Nikki said softly. Mr. Dan was making pretty lights on his safe. Fred glanced toward the office, saw nothing unusual, and assumed she meant the decorative lighting. "Come on, baby. It's late. Let's get you to bed." They walked back to the servant quarters together, Nikki's small hand in her father's larger one. Fred thought she was tired, maybe confused from being woken up so late. He had no idea what his daughter had just witnessed. What pattern her extraordinary mind had just captured and stored with perfect, permanent recall. In her bed that night, Nikki lay awake, the sequence replaying in her mind like a favorite song. Tap tap slide. Press hold release. Double tap. Final hold. Blue lights dancing in patterns across the darkness behind her closed eyes. She didn't know it was important. Didn't understand that she just memorized the key to Harold Dan's fortress. Didn't realize that in 10 days, this pattern would unlock more than just a vault. It would unlock justice. 3 days after his celebration, Harold Dan woke to a crisis that would unravel everything. His phone was vibrating with messages from the Saudi partners. The contract required proof of fund transfers by week's end, verification that Dan Oil Corporation had the liquidity to execute the $2 billion deal. The access codes for his offshore accounts, the documentation proving his financial capacity, all of it was locked inside the vault. No problem. He'd opened it hundreds of times. Dan approached the titanium monolith confidently, his fingers moving toward the biometric panel. He pressed the sequence, or what he thought was the sequence. The panel flashed red. Locked. Confusion flickered across his face. He tried again, more carefully this time. Upper left twice? Or was it upper right? Middle pressure point, or was it the lower one? Red. Locked. 6 more attempts. 6 more failures. Each one tightening the knot of panic in his chest. By noon, Dan was on the phone with Vault Tech Berlin, his voice sharp with desperation. "I can't open my own vault." "What is your emergency override code, Mr. Dan?" Dr. Werner's voice was maddeningly calm. "You said there was no override." "That's what I demanded." "Correct. We built exactly what you specified. No backup access means no backup access. If you've forgotten the sequence." "I haven't forgotten," Dan shouted. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Had he? The celebration had been excessive. The champagne, the bourbon afterward. Had he tried to open the vault while intoxicated and inadvertently changed something? The Saudi partners called again. The deal was collapsing. 400 million in immediate assets trapped. His empire crumbling because he couldn't access his own fortress. Day 1 brought 3 vault experts from Houston. They deployed acoustic sensors, pressure analysis equipment, thermal imaging. Hours of sophisticated technology yielded nothing. The biometric system was too advanced, too precisely calibrated. Dan started drinking that evening. Heavily. Days 4 through 6 blurred into a nightmare of escalating desperation. Israeli security specialists, former Mossad, arrived with seismic sensors and AI pattern recognition software. They failed. Swiss bank vault consultants tried every manipulation technique known to their profession. Nothing. Japanese specialists brought quantum computing analysis tools. Still the vault remained sealed, its red locked status glowing like a wound. On day 6, American military vault crackers, men who'd cracked Taliban strongholds, spent 12 hours attempting to bypass the system. They left defeated. Dan's office transformed into a war room. Equipment cases stacked in corners. Cables snaking across marble floors. Technicians working in shifts around the clock. And through it all, the vault stood unmoved, impassive, mocking. Business partners whispered in corners. Why couldn't he access his own accounts? What was he hiding? Media rumors began circulating. Dan Oil Corporation facing liquidity crisis? The stock price dropped 8%, then 12, then 15 over 6 days. Dan's racism, usually coded in careful language, emerged raw under stress. I'm paying you people millions and you can't do this simple task, he'd snap at specialists who'd flown in from across the globe to help him. Fred continued his duties, driving Dan to emergency meetings with lawyers and investors. Sometimes Nikki accompanied him, sitting silently in the back seat, watching and listening. During one return to the compound, Nikki glimpsed the office through the window, the vault's glowing red locked status visible even from the car. Her mind immediately recalled the pattern from 10 days ago. Tap tap slide. Press hold release. Double tap. Final hold. I know that pattern, she thought. I watched Mr. Dan make it. But she said nothing. Invisible children didn't speak unless spoken to. Her father had taught her that. Day 7, morning. The breaking point. Global Vault Solutions arrived at dawn, 3 specialists with equipment that cost more than Fred earned in 5 years. The best in the world, Dan's assistant had promised. His last hope. By 10 a.m., the office was packed. 20 people crowded into the space, lawyers reviewing contract language, business partners calculating losses, technicians from 6 failed attempts comparing notes, and the new team setting up yet another round of sophisticated sensors. At 2:47 p.m., the Saudi partners issued their final ultimatum via conference call, their voices echoing through speakerphones. Proof of funds by 6 p.m., Mr. Dan, or the contract is void. We have other suppliers waiting. Dan stood in the center of his office, surrounded by the evidence of his failure. 7 days. 6 expert teams. Millions spent. And the vault remained as impenetrable as the day it was installed. His fortress had become his prison. And time was running out. At 3:15 p.m., Harold Dan poured bourbon with shaking hands, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim of his crystal tumbler. The lead specialist from Global Vault Solutions, a gray-haired woman with 30 years of experience, delivered the verdict he couldn't accept. Mr. Dan, without the exact sequence, we're looking at 6 weeks minimum to crack this system. Possibly 3 months. I don't have 3 months. Dan's voice cracked. I don't have 3 days. On the speakerphone, the Saudi representative's voice was cold and final. Mr. Dan, we're moving to other suppliers. This deal is finished. Marcus Chen, Dan's business partner of 8 years, stepped forward. Harold, you're destroying the company. Just accept. $300 million. The words exploded from Dan, fueled by bourbon and desperation, echoing off the office walls. Anyone who opens this vault takes $300 million. The room went silent. 20 people frozen mid-motion. Dan's lawyers exchanged alarmed glances. That was a binding contract offer, made in front of witnesses. Marcus Chen quietly pulled out his phone and started recording. 2 vault specialists activated their body cameras. Dan's security system was already capturing everything from 3 angles. Near the doorway, Fred James stood with Nikki, preparing to leave. He'd only brought her because the school was closed for Teacher Development Day. They shouldn't even be here. Nikki tugged her father's sleeve. Daddy, I can open it. Shoo, baby. We need to go. Fred's voice was gentle but firm. But Nikki stepped forward, her yellow dress bright against the dark office furnishings, her pink hair ribbons catching the light. 20 sets of eyes turned toward her. Mr. Dan, may I try? The room froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Equipment stopped humming. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Dan's face transformed in stages, shock, recognition, then something uglier. Contempt mixed with disbelief. Who let the help's kid in here? His words were sharp, dismissive. Fred, get her out. Fred moved forward, embarrassed. I'm sorry, Mr. Dan. Come on, Nikki. But Nikki stood firm, her small frame somehow radiating determination. You said anyone, Mr. Dan. Anyone who opens it gets $300 million. Dan laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that made Fred flinch. You think a child, a little girl playing in her daddy's back seat, can crack a vault that defeated 6 international teams? The best specialist's money couldn't open it, and you think, he didn't finish, just shook his head in contemptuous amusement. Marcus Chen stepped forward, his phone still recording. Harold, you made a public offer. We all heard it. Dr. Sarah Martinez, one of the vault specialists, nodded. The contract is binding regardless of who attempts. Dan waved dismissively, bourbon sloshing in his glass. Fine. Let the helps kid play with the $1 million toy. When she fails, and she will fail, maybe Fred will finally teach her about knowing her place. His racism, usually coded in careful language, emerged raw and undisguised. These people and their delusions. Probably been putting ideas in her head, Fred. Making her think she's special, that she belongs in spaces like this. Fred's eyes filled with tears as he tried to pull Nikki back. Baby, please. But Nikki walked toward the vault, each small step deliberate and certain. At 8 years old, she was far too short to reach the biometric panel mounted at adult height. Dr. Martinez quietly brought over a chair, placing it before the towering titanium structure. Nikki climbed up, her small hands trembling slightly as she gripped the chair's back for balance. Dan smirked, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable failure. Around the room, 6 cameras recorded from different angles, phones, body cameras, security system, all capturing this moment. Nikki closed her eyes. In her mind, the pattern from 10 days ago played like a favorite song: tap tap slide, press hold release, double tap, final press. Blue lights dancing in sequence. Dan's drunken narration echoing, upper left again, slide right. She opened her eyes. Her small fingers moved across the glowing panel with surprising confidence. Upper left, tap. Upper left again, tap. Slide right to zone 3. Blue lights followed her touches, confirming each correct pressure point. The room watched in stunned silence. Middle pressure point, zone 6. Press, hold for 3 seconds, release. Blue light sustained, then faded. Bottom corners in rapid sequence, tap zone 3, tap zone 7, tap zone 11, tap zone 2. For blue flashes like musical notes. Final press hold. Zone 9. Nikki's small finger pressed firmly for 5 seconds. Sustained blue light washed across the panel. 37 seconds had elapsed from first touch. Then nothing. 8 seconds of silence. The panel dark. Dan started to laugh. See? I told you. Click. The sound was deep, mechanical, unmistakable. Internal hydraulics engaging. The vault status display changed from red, locked, to green, open. The massive titanium door, 4 tons of German engineering, swung outward smoothly on its perfectly calibrated hinges. Total time from Nikki's first touch to the door opening, 45 seconds. Stunned silence. No one moved. No one breathed. 20 people stared at the open vault, then at the small black girl in the yellow dress standing on a chair, her hands still raised toward the panel. Inside the vault, clearly visible to everyone in the room, were stacks of bearer bonds, bundles of cash in multiple currencies, cryptocurrency hardware wallets, and rows of file boxes. File boxes with labels written in Dan's own handwriting, facing outward. EPA violation reports 2006 to 2024. Trinity County Cancer Cluster Studies, confidential. Contaminated site studies. Bribery receipts, EPA officials. Evidence. 18 years of environmental crimes. All visible. All exposed. Then chaos erupted. The silence shattered like glass. Specialists gasped. Marcus Chen whispered, "Oh my God." Someone's phone clattered to the floor. Dan's face cycled through emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, humiliation, then pure rage. His careful control, already eroded by 7 days of failure and bourbon, finally snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Nikki's arm with brutal force. Yanked her off the chair. Her small body lifted into the air, feet dangling, yellow dress twisting around her. "How did you know?" Dan's voice was a roar. "Who told you? Did your father steal the code?" He shook her violently. Nikki cried out in pain, her head snapping back and forth. "Let go of my daughter." Fred rushed forward, ignoring every instinct that told him not to challenge his employer. Dan shoved him with his free hand. Fred crashed into the wall, his shoulder impacting the corner with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, gasping. Dr. Martinez moved fast. She grabbed Dan's wrist and twisted with surprising strength. "Mr. Dan, you're assaulting a child." The pain forced Dan to release his grip. Nikki fell to the floor, sobbing. Bright red marks circled her small arm where Dan had gripped her. Fred crawled across the floor despite the agony in his shoulder, gathering his daughter in his good arm. She buried her face against his chest, her whole body shaking. "This is theft. Conspiracy." Dan's voice was wild now, all pretense of control gone. "That little brat and her father planned this." Marcus Chen held his phone steady, still recording. "Harold, you made a public offer. 12 witnesses heard you." "I meant actual professionals." Dan spat. Not some welfare kid who probably can't even spell vault. You people are always looking for handouts, always trying to take what isn't yours. His racism, fully exposed now, echoed through the office where 6 cameras captured every word. While Dan raged, Dr. Martinez moved closer to the open vault. Her eyes widened at what she saw, not just wealth, but evidence. She pulled out her phone and began photographing. File boxes clearly labeled in Dan's handwriting, EPA Violation Reports 2006 to 2024. Trinity County Cancer Cluster Study, confidential. Marcus Chen zoomed in with his phone, capturing documents visible on top of stacks, EPA Inspector Bribery Receipts 2015 to 2024. Illegal dumping site coordinates. Jennifer Walsh, another business partner, photographed a map on the vault's shelf, 23 communities marked in red, predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods surrounding Dan's refineries. David Kim, a specialist, captured an image of a spreadsheet titled Acceptable Cancer Rate Projections by Demographic. What are you doing? Dan noticed suddenly, his voice sharp with panic. That's private property. Those are privileged documents. Dr. Martinez turned to face him, her expression cold. This is evidence of environmental crimes, Mr. Dan. I'm ethically obligated to report what I see. Dan went pale. His eyes darted to the security cameras mounted in the corners, cameras he'd installed himself. Cameras that had been recording everything. The vault's contents. His assault on a child. His racist tirade. His own words admitting to crimes. His fortress had become his exposure. At 3:47 p.m., Dan tried desperately to regain control. Delete those photos now, or I'll sue every one of you into bankruptcy. Marcus Chen's voice was steady. Harold, we're already past that point. You assaulted a child on camera. You refused to honor a binding contract. And now we can all see what you've been hiding. Those people in those communities. Dan's panic made him reckless. They were there before my refineries. It's not my fault they're too poor to move to safer areas. Jennifer Walsh stared at him in disgust. Did you just admit on camera that you knowingly poisoned residential areas? Dan realized what he'd said. That's not, I didn't mean. But the damage was done. Everything recorded. Everything documented from 6 different sources. Fred struggled to his feet, cradling Nikki with his good arm. We're leaving. You're fired, Fred. Both of you. Dan's voice was venomous. And you're not getting a cent of that $300 million. Marcus Chen stepped between them. Actually, Harold, that contract is legally binding. You made the offer in front of witnesses. Oral contracts are enforceable in Texas for specific performance. Get out. Dan screamed. All of you. Get out of my office before I call security. They filed out quickly, specialists gathering equipment, business partners backing away from the man they'd thought they knew. Marcus helped Fred and Nikki to his car, Jennifer supporting Fred's injured side. Dr. Martinez was already on her phone with her lawyer before she cleared the compound gates. By 4:15 p.m., they were all gone. Dan stood alone in his office. The open vault mocked him with its exposed secrets. The security cameras continued recording his breakdown, capturing the moment when an empire built on poison and prejudice began its inevitable collapse. At 9:23 p.m., Marcus Chen sat in his home office, staring at the footage on his laptop screen. He'd watched it 4 times already. Each viewing made his stomach turn. He'd been Dan's business partner for 8 years. Profited from the company's success. Turned a blind eye to things he suspected but never confirmed. Until today, when ignorance became impossible. On screen, Nikki's terrified face as Dan shook her. Fred crashing into the wall. Dan's racist tirade. And those file boxes, EPA violation reports, cancer cluster studies, bribery receipts, all clearly visible. Marcus, you know what you have to do. His wife Linda stood in the doorway, her voice gentle but firm. He did know. Had known since he helped Fred and Nikki into his car, since he saw the red marks on that little girl's arm. Marcus uploaded the video simultaneously to Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Title: Oil Baron offers $300 million to open vault, then assaults 8-year-old girl who succeeds, environmental crimes exposed. 14 minutes of footage. Dan's desperate offer. Nikki's courage. The vault opening. The assault. The refusal to pay. And crucially, clear images of the environmental crime documents, contamination maps, bribery receipts. He added still photographs, zoomed-in images of the file labels. His caption was simple: I can no longer be silent about what I witnessed today. #Justice for Nikki #environmental racism. He clicked post and watched his career end. The explosion was immediate. 11:47 p.m., 50,000 views 2 a.m., 500,000 views 6 a.m., 3 million views, Hashtag Justice for Nikki starting to trend 9 a.m., 8 million views, trending worldwide by noon, 15 million views, every major news outlet covering the story. Environmental justice organizations shared the footage frantically. The Sierra Club, Greenpeace, local community groups, all amplifying the message. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding prosecution. Then celebrities joined in. A Grammy-winning singer with 40 million followers posted, "An 8-year-old black girl solved the impossible and got assaulted for it while this man hid environmental crimes. This is America. Hashtag Justice for Nikki." An actor known for environmental activism wrote, "I've watched this 5 times and I'm sick. Those contamination maps show predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods. This isn't just racism, it's environmental genocide." The comments section became a testimony wall. People identifying their communities from the visible maps. "That's my neighborhood. My mother died of cancer at 47. My son has asthma. We've been breathing poison for years. Trinity County resident here. Everyone on my street has health problems. Now we know why." Harold Dan woke at 6:30 a.m. to his phone vibrating continuously. Notifications flooding in faster than he could read them. His name was trending. But not for business success. His face, red, drunk, violent, was screenshotted everywhere. The moment he grabbed Nikki. The moment he shoved Fred. His twisted expression as he screamed racist slurs. His words were quoted in tweet after tweet, "Those people were there before my refineries, too poor to move." By 8 a.m., business partners were issuing statements distancing themselves. Jennifer Walsh announced her immediate resignation. Marcus Chen's open letter went viral separately, detailing 8 years of concerns he'd ignored. The stock price opened at $147 per share. By 9 a.m., it hit $120. By noon, $89. Free fall. At 2 p.m., protesters began gathering outside the compound gates. 50 people at first, then 200. They held signs, "Justice for Nikki." Environmental racism kills. Black lives matter more than oil profits. News vans lined the street. Helicopters circled overhead. While Dan watched his empire crumble on television, federal agencies were mobilizing. The EPA regional director called an emergency meeting after watching the footage. The visible documents in that vault, if authentic, represented the largest environmental crime case in Texas history. The DOJ Environmental Crimes Section began reviewing the zoomed-in photographs Marcus had included. EPA Inspector Bribery Receipts 2015 to 2024. That alone was federal racketeering. The FBI opened an investigation into the bribery allegations. $67 million in payoffs, if Dan's own records were accurate. The Texas Attorney General announced a formal inquiry by mid-morning. Within 24 hours, 3 federal agencies were coordinating. Dr. Martinez provided her testimony and photographs. Marcus Chen turned over additional evidence, emails, financial records, documents from 8 years of partnership that suddenly looked very different in light of what the vault had revealed. The fortress Dan had built to protect his secrets had instead become the beacon that exposed them all. Justice, it turned out, didn't need a key. It just needed a courageous 8-year-old girl and a smartphone camera. Day 10 began at 6 a.m. with coordinated federal raids. 40 FBI and EPA agents executed search warrants simultaneously across 12 Dan Oil Corporation locations. The main compound. Corporate headquarters in downtown Houston. 4 refinery offices. The offshore records facility in Galveston. What they found exceeded even the prosecutor's expectations. 18 years of falsified environmental reports. $67 million in bribery documentation, meticulously recorded. Internal studies showing cancer clusters in 23 communities, studies Dan had commissioned, then buried. And most damning, an internal memo in Dan's own handwriting, target low-income minority neighborhoods for facility placement, they lack resources to fight back legally. Evidence of deliberate groundwater contamination affecting 847 families across 5 states. Not accidents. Not negligence. Calculated environmental racism, documented in Dan's own files. The arrests began swiftly. Day 12, Dan arrested at his compound, charged with environmental crimes, racketeering, assault of a minor, and bribery. His perp walk was broadcast live on every major network. Day 14, the CFO arrested for conspiracy. Day 18, 4 board members, they'd known about the contamination, approved the cover-ups. Day 22, 3 EPA officials who'd taken bribes. 14 people total, charged in a conspiracy that had poisoned communities for profit. The lawsuits came next. The ACLU took Fred and Nikki's case pro bono, breach of contract, assault, wrongful termination. A coalition of environmental justice lawyers filed a massive class action representing 847 families whose water, air, and land Dan had poisoned. 14 months later, the federal courthouse was packed. Media, community members, protesters. The trial lasted 3 months. Expert witnesses testified about cancer clusters, groundwater contamination, respiratory diseases ravaging entire neighborhoods. Community members took the stand with gut-wrenching stories: children who died of leukemia, parents with lung cancer who'd never smoked, entire families with mysterious illnesses. Dan's own words, recorded in that office, played repeatedly for the jury: "Those people were there before my refineries, too poor to move, acceptable cancer rates." The jury deliberated 8 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Maria Santos's voice shook with controlled fury at sentencing. "Mr. Dan, you poisoned communities for profit. You targeted vulnerable people because you believed they couldn't fight back. You assaulted a child who exposed your crimes. You represent the worst of corporate America." 22 years in federal prison. $300 million to Nikki James. $890 million in EPA fines. $1.2 billion in class action settlements for the 847 families. Lifetime ban from the oil industry. Dan Oil Corporation dissolved, all assets liquidated for victim compensation. 2 years after the vault opening, Nikki James stood before a microphone in Trinity County, one of the most contaminated communities. Now 10 years old, she wore a yellow dress and held oversized scissors. Behind her, a renovated community center housed the Environmental Justice Foundation's first health clinic. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, powered by clean energy purchased with Dan's seized assets. Fred stood beside her, recovered from his shoulder injury, now the foundation's community outreach director. Around them, 847 families who'd suffered in silence for decades finally had medical care, relocation assistance, compensation for loved ones lost to Dan's poison. Nikki cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted in applause. When the noise settled, she spoke softly into the microphone. "My daddy always told me I see patterns nobody else sees. I saw the pattern to open Mr. Dan's vault. But I also saw another pattern: how powerful people hurt communities that look like mine. How they hide crimes behind locked doors." She gestured to the clinic, the solar panels, the children playing in the park built on cleaned-up land. "Today I see a new pattern. I see healing. I see justice. I see us taking back our health and our dignity." The camera panned across the crowd, an elderly woman crying, holding a photo of her dead husband. A young mother with a healthy child who'd received treatment from the foundation. A former refinery worker who'd testified against Dan, finally able to breathe clean air. Fred hugged his daughter. "You changed the world, baby girl." Nikki shook her head. "No, Daddy. We all did. Together." Later, Nikki and Fred walked through the transformed community. Where refineries once belched poison, solar farms now generated clean energy. Where contaminated playgrounds once stood, health clinics now served families. Where people had suffered in silence, they now thrived with support. The Environmental Justice Foundation had helped all 847 families, cleaned 23 communities, established medical monitoring for over 2,000 people. Dan's law, passed by Congress 6 months ago, now required health monitoring in all communities near industrial facilities. At the foundation office, Nikki sat at her desk, working on a new puzzle. "What pattern should we solve next, Daddy?" Fred smiled. "There are always more patterns, baby. Always more justice to find." Text appeared on screen. The Environmental Justice Foundation has helped 2,000+ families affected by corporate pollution. 14 executives from Dan Oil Corporation are serving prison sentences totaling 187 years. Harold Dan, 42, is serving 22 years at Federal Correctional Institution. Earliest parole, 2041. Nikki James, 10, continues working on puzzles and patterns of justice with her father. Sometimes the children we overlook hold the keys to truth. Sometimes 45 seconds of courage can change hundreds of lives. Sometimes justice is just a pattern away. Thank you for watching till the end. Click subscribe and let me know the lessons you learned in the comment below, and turn on the notification bell because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it.